Okay, so we're at Chapter 7 now, the American Revolution. Just to briefly recap, the colonists have been living in England for quite a while now, and unfortunately King George has been taxing the colonists. Parliament is not giving colonists their fair say in the colonies or in Parliament, and the colonists are being taxed without their representation. So the colonists draft the Olive Branch Petition in an effort to avoid war and to make peace with King George. King George rejects the petition, calls the colonists traitors, and so the colonists, along with Thomas Jefferson, feel the need to draft the Declaration of Independence and finally, formally declare their independence from England. So that's where we are now. So now, first I'd like you to do this warm-up. It's a right to learn. What do you see here? What do you think this picture represents and why? Take a moment, write down your thoughts, pause the video, and then you can come back. Okay, so this picture is obviously the name of it, or at the bottom it says Join or Die. This was actually done by Benjamin Franklin, and it first appeared in the Pennsylvania Gazette. Now, initially, this was meant to encourage the colonies to join together in order to fight against France. However, as time went on, it became kind of a symbol just to unite the colonies in general and ultimately to unite the colonies to fight against England and to fight for independence. So the names you see, the letters you see here, the NE are the New England colonies, then there's New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So these letters represent names of colonies. So, and it actually is a very basic map. It kind of does show where the colonies are located, although it's sideways, but it kind of gives you an idea of where they are in proximity to each other. So here's a few vocab words. I'm not going to go over these in great length, but I want you to see them. Revolutionary War was the struggle for independence between Britain and the colonists. Mercenaries are professional soldiers who are paid to fight. So they are not just fighting for their country, and all soldiers are paid for the most part. Like our American soldiers receive some compensation, British soldiers were paid, but mercenaries are people that don't have any stake in the war itself. They're not, their groups are not part of the war, but like we'll talk about soldiers in Russia that helped fight with the British. They weren't part of the war, but they were paid to join the war to help the British. Allies, nations that join together. You'll see as we talk about this particular war, the French and actually Spain became the allies of the United States, or of America, the colonies. Strategy is a plan or method used to achieve a specific goal. Teachers use strategies when we teach. So we might use a graffiti walk strategy, or a gallery walk, or a right to learn. Those are all strategies. Guerrillas, soldiers who are not part of a regular army. So these are soldiers that can be fighting, like they could be Americans that are fighting as guerrilla soldiers in this particular war, but they are not officially soldiers. You'll see that one of the reasons that the colonists were successful in this war was because of their guerrilla tactics. Like they didn't take the regular army route, marching in straight lines, wearing pretty fancy clothing. They hid behind bushes and hid in trees and surprised people and planned sneak attacks. They didn't fight like a normal army, so they fought guerrilla style. And then a treaty is an agreement between two nations. I think a lot of you are already familiar with that word, but ultimately when this war ends, it ends with a treaty. So now let's talk about advantages and disadvantages. We're going to start with the Continental Army. Advantages, first of all, they were fighting for their homes and their freedom. So think about it. The British were not necessarily, it wasn't on their own turf. The colonists were fighting for their own personal individual independence. So it was a much more personal fight than for the British. They had great leadership of George Washington, who was an experienced soldier in battle, experienced general. He was a strong leader for the Continental Army. They were helped by the French, who were arguably one of the strongest armies in the world. So it was helpful to have an army, a group that had experience and had weapons and had money to fund a war. Disadvantages, however, there was no navy. The colonists hadn't been around long enough. They hadn't built up enough people or enough ships. So they didn't have a navy, and the British had the strongest navy in the world. They were untrained and fewer soldiers. So you'll see as we talk that like when the troops went to Valley Forge, they did receive some training, but typically they really had no training other than just training their on the job quote-unquote training when they were in battles and learning as they went. And there were far fewer soldiers than they had in the British Army. And they also had few supplies, few weapons, few guns, few gunpowder, few cannons. So that was a constant struggle. And we already talked about that a little bit last chapter. So here's just an image of the Continental Army. Some of these soldiers, you'll notice, do have on uniforms. Most of them did not wear uniforms. The uniforms were a luxury, and a lot of soldiers just wore their own clothes. We'll talk about a winter when it was really cold, like in Valley Forge that I mentioned, where their shoes were so worn out, they had holes in the bottom, and people were just trying to patch them in order to be able to not get frostbite as they walked around. So now, British Army. British Army had several advantages. They had highly trained, experienced soldiers, so they had fought in many wars. They had specific training. I mean, they were ready to fight. They had far more soldiers, more weapons and gunpowder, and supplies in general. They were not short of uniforms and shoes and food like the Continental Army was. They had the most powerful navy in the world, which is really important. Disadvantages. The war was fought far from home, so soldiers didn't necessarily feel that urgency because it wasn't happening in their backyard. There were less reasons to fight hard. So that's another thing. The soldiers were like, well, yeah, we don't want to die. We'll fight hard enough not to die, but we don't really care about whether we lose the colonies or not. This was more King George's concern and maybe Parliament's concern, but the soldiers could care less. And then finally, they had poor leadership. Their leaders were not as strategic as George Washington and some of the other leaders in the Continental Army. So here's an image of the redcoats, the lobsterbacks, the British soldiers in their fancy uniforms with their bright, sparkly buttons going down their boots, going on to battle. So I have a clip of a movie, The Patriot, that some of you might have seen, so we'll show that now. Just watch.
Listen to me. I'll fire first. I want you two to start with the officers and work your way down.
Watch carefully for the guerrilla tactics I talked about.
Yes, Father.
Yes, Father. Good. Samuel, after your first shot, I want you to reload for your brother Nathan. Now, if anything should happen to me, I want you two to drop your weapons and I want you to run as quickly as you can. Now you hide in the brush, make your way home, get your brother and your sisters, and you take them to your Aunt Charlotte's. Understood? What did I tell you fellas about shooting?
Aim small, miss small.
Aim small, miss small. Boys, Samuel, steady.
Mel Gibson is a patriot fighting with the Continental Army. These are the British soldiers coming on their big horses, their nice clean uniforms. Meanwhile, Mel Gibson and his sons are hiding up on a hill behind trees to surprise them. See, the soldiers have no idea where that came from. Okay, I just wanted you to see how the Patriots fought and compared to the British Army. Now, of course, the British troops were surprised, but they definitely weren't used to fighting that way, hiding in ditches or behind trees or in trees or doing sneak attacks. The British just didn't fight that way. That's not how most armies of the day fought. So the colonists, really, it was a benefit to them that they knew the land. They were literally fighting in their backyard, so they knew the area, they knew where would be good places to hide, they knew like where there were hills that could get up high and look down low. They definitely had a benefit, and they took advantage of it. Instead of fighting in those straight rows and those bright blue uniforms, most of them fought in their normal clothes that blended in with the scenery. They were dirty, they were tattered, but they were able to hide and then sneak up on the British, who would arguably have been the strongest military at the time. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what that would have looked like. So now let's talk a little bit about African Americans. So African Americans definitely had a part in the Revolutionary War. They hoped that all men created equal, that language from the Declaration, would apply to them. At first, the African Americans were banned from the Continental Army. This was because George Washington did not want the Army to become a haven or a safe place. Safe place is another phrase. It means, haven is a word that means safe place. George Washington didn't want the Army to become a haven or a safe place for escaped slaves. He didn't want escaped slaves or runaway slaves to run away, leave their plantations, and join the Continental Army to be safe. He didn't want that. Great Britain, however, said, hey, if you come fight for us, we'll give you freedom. We'll help you out. You can help us, and we'll help you. So, now there was a battle in New York. The Americans and the British met in New York. The Americans were pretty confident. They were feeling good and feeling like, we have great leadership, we're strong, we're prepared. Unfortunately, they lost to the British. And General Howe, if you remember hearing about him last chapter, General Howe from Great Britain thought, okay, this is our chance. George Washington will surrender. They'll realize that they can't take us on. But Washington refused to surrender. He said, we're going to continue fighting. This was just one loss. We'll continue fighting. And the Americans did have several losses. So after all of that, after New York and several losses after that, George Washington needed to find a way to motivate his troops so they would keep fighting and stay strong and stay motivated. So Thomas Paine had actually written another pamphlet called The Crisis. And in The Crisis, George Washington took it upon himself to read this pamphlet to his soldiers to encourage them to push on just a little farther. And those words actually helped the Continental Army take on the Hessians, who were the German mercenaries, helped them overtake them in Trenton. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so battles of Trenton and Princeton. So, December 25th, 1776, that day probably seems, to some of you might be familiar with that particular date, December 25th. The Hessians were the German soldiers, and they were sleeping off their Christmas feast in alcoholic celebration. General Washington kind of had that in the back of his mind. This might be a good day to overtake these mercenaries. So General Washington led his troops across the Delaware River in New Jersey, and this is a picture of George Washington, a painting of him crossing the Delaware. And we actually see this painting when we go to D.C., I believe. The next day, so the Hessians were sleeping off their Christmas feast. The next day, when the Continental Army reached Trenton, New Jersey, the Army captured over 1,400 Hessians in Trenton. They didn't lose a single man, meaning none of the Americans were killed in this capture, and none of the Hessians were killed either. They actually captured all of the men and held them, and so kind of send a message to England, but also to just get those mercenaries off of their radar so they could no longer fight them. As they retreated, the Americans also went ahead to defeat the British in Princeton. So as they were going back, they ran into some British in Princeton and defeated them as well. So, the Battle of Saratoga, this happened in October of 1777. This is a very big battle. The British general sent 700 Hessians to look for supplies. So, the British are running out of things, so he's like, you got to go get some supplies for us. The Americans launched a sneak attack defeating the Hessians. who were looking for the supplies. This was actually a turning point. So when the Americans defeated these German mercenaries, the French took notice, and they said, wow, these Americans are serious, but they could maybe use our help. We don't like the British, so maybe we'll help the Americans defeat the British. So this is a huge turning point. I will ask you this over and over again. What was the turning point of the Revolutionary War? It was the Battle of Saratoga. A couple years ago, the students tried to remember this, find a way to remember this, and they said the Battle of Saratoga when the French came over. So use it if it helps you. This battle convinced France to become an ally of the United States. France, of course, equaled money, weapons, and soldiers. I don't have that on my slide, but it also meant more bodies as well. So here's just an image of the Battle of Saratoga, a painting. And now Valley Forge, I alluded to this earlier. Valley Forge it happened over the winter in Valley Forge. George Washington's troops were suffering severely, and I mentioned this before. They had poor clothing. They lacked warm clothing completely. A lot of them didn't have shoes, and if they did have shoes, they were full of holes, and so they were being patched. If they could be patched, their soldiers got frostbite from being out in the cold weather. They were starving. They had disease, which runs rampant in close quarters like that. However, Frederick von Steuben came and he actually trained the soldiers, helped them to stay alive. He said, you know, we're not going to just lay around and die of hunger and being cold. We're going to fight, and we're going to learn how to defeat the British. And so Frederick von Steuben came and trained the soldiers, prepared them for more battles. Like, we're going to get out of this cold, horrible winter, and we're going to be stronger for it. So here's an image of the winter in Valley Forge. This is George Washington here. They don't look particularly cold in this picture, but they were. Definitely. Most of them didn't have these fancy uniforms. They had clothes, much like what you saw Mel Gibson wearing in the video clip I showed you. So, Battle at Yorktown. The way the students remembered this one, the Battle at Yorktown, where it all went down. So, this was the final battle in the Revolutionary War, and it was pretty exciting. So, General Cornwallis, he was the British general. He set up camp in Yorktown, Virginia, thinking, you know, we're going to set up here, we're close to the ocean, this is a good place to get supplies, we're good. The French, however, blocked the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, preventing Cornwallis from getting supplies. So Cornwallis is sitting there with his men thinking, any day now, we're going to get more troops, we're going to get more supplies, we're going to get more weapons, more gunpowder, so we can finally win this war. Well, support never came because the French were keeping the British Navy from getting in. George Washington, on the other hand, came around the other way and marched into Yorktown from New York with over 16,000 Continental Army troops and French troops. So, the U.S. and French troops cornered Cornwallis. He was stuck. He wasn't able to get any more help from England. He was running out of men, running out of supplies, running out of food, and completely cornered by the U.S. and the French. They cornered him in Yorktown, and so Cornwallis surrendered April 19, 1781, ending the Revolutionary War. And here's an image, and actually Cornwallis kind of came limping in to the American side to meet with George Washington, and he just kind of turned over his sword, and he didn't want to. He really fought it out, really fought not to surrender, but in the end it was the best thing for him to do. And so now the war is over. The British and the colonies have won their independence against all odds. And so the two countries got together to draft the Treaty of Paris. And it was to come to some agreement on how they would, British and the colonies, or now the United States, would deal with each other from then forward. So the first part, and I will ask you these three parts over and over again. The first part, the British must recognize, or would recognize, the United States as an independent nation. So they would no longer refer to the United States as a colony. They would no longer be in control. The U.S. was now in control of itself. Secondly, the U.S. territory would stretch from Canada all the way to Florida, and then from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. So half of the United States, or over half of the United States, was still controlled by other countries. Like Spain was out there, France was out there, but everything from the Mississippi River east and then from Canada south would all be controlled by the United States. And then finally, the United States promised to ask the states to help repay the Loyalists for anything that was lost in the war. So the Loyalists that kind of ran off to Boston or Canada after the siege of Boston, Loyalists that stayed in the colonies and didn't fight for independence but were still loyal to the king, those Loyalists would receive back any property that they had lost. However, most states did pay the Loyalists nothing. And then here's an image of the powers that be signing the Treaty of Paris. Okay, so that's the last slide, guys. I need you to review your notes. Make sure you do your blog post. Come to class by Friday, prepared in case something pops up on you. All right, have a good evening.